Imagine being just 6 years old. Most children at that age are learning to read, playing with toys, or holding their parents' hands. But in 1389, a little girl named Isabelle of France was led down a grand aisle, dressed in a wedding gown, so heavy it nearly dragged her to the floor, to marry a man 23 years older, the King of England. This is not a fairy tale. This is the real horrifying story of the youngest queen in history. A child sold for peace, stripped of her innocence, and remembered not for the crown she wore, but for the trauma she endured. The late 14th century was a time when marriage wasn't always about love. It was about power, land, and politics. France and England had been locked in the brutal 100 Years' War. Thousands had died. Kingdoms were bleeding wealth. Then, in November 1389, a truce was negotiated. But peace had a price, and that price was a little girl. Isabelle of France, the daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, became the bargaining chip. At just 5 years old, her life was no longer her own. She was promised to Richard II of England, a man nearly 30 years old. The treaty was explicit. France would receive peace for 28 years. England would receive Isabelle, along with a staggering dowry of 800,000 livres, a fortune in medieval terms. Hidden in the marriage contract was a chilling clause. Richard II would have all rights of a husband from the moment of marriage, no matter the bride's age. This was not unusual in medieval politics. But for Isabelle, it was the beginning of a life of surveillance, control, and fear. On the day of the wedding, Isabelle wore a gown adorned with jewels and gold thread, a dress heavier than her small body could bear. Witnesses described her as a tiny, pale child, walking stiffly, unable to even lift her train without help. Some English lords, uncomfortable with the match, suggested that Richard wait until she was older. But others were eager to see the marriage consummated, as if a 6-year-old could ever give consent. Once in England, Isabelle lived in what was essentially a royal cage. Iron bars were installed on her bedroom windows, not to protect her, but to make sure she didn't escape. She was constantly watched by attendants, and her every move was reported. English nobles even performed humiliating inspections. Isabelle was expected to act as queen, attending ceremonies and standing beside Richard as a symbol of peace, all while still learning to read and write. In 1399, Richard II was overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV. Isabelle, now around 9 years old, was suddenly a political pawn once again. Henry IV demanded she marry his son, but Isabelle refused. She wrote heartbreaking letters to her father in France. In one, she wrote, "I am but a child, and yet I am held here against my will. I long to see my mother again." Her defiance was remarkable for a girl so young, but it came at a cost. She was kept in isolation for months. Finally, after intense negotiations, Isabelle was sent back to France in 1401. She was 11 years old, but had already lived through more political turmoil and personal violation than most adults. In France, she was married again, this time to Charles, Duke of Orleans. Though he was closer to her age, the damage had already been done. Years of emotional trauma and political manipulation had taken their toll. At just 20 years old, Isabelle died. Today, Isabelle of France is often a footnote in history, a name on a treaty, a pawn in royal games. But behind the dusty records lies the story of a child who never had a choice. Her life reminds us that behind medieval romance was often cruelty. The next time you hear a medieval love story, remember Isabelle, the queen who was never allowed to be a child. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe for more investigations into the dark truths behind royal history. And tell me in the comments, does Isabelle's story change the way you see medieval kings and queens?